Welcome back to Amazing Stories, where we tell you history in a unique way. Today, we're diving right into the story of El Chapo, Joaquín Guzmán Lora. Let's start from the beginning. In the mountains of the Sierra Madre Occidental, where the greenery is so thick it seems to swallow up the roads and the silence is broken only by crickets and distant gunshots, Joaquín Archibaldo Guzmán Lora was born. It was April 4, 1957, when the man who would later be known as El Chapo came into the world. He was born in La Tuna, a small village in the municipality of Badiraguato, Sinaloa. A land forgotten by the government, but rich in poverty, poppies, and future drug lords. He was the eldest child in a humble family. His father, Emilio Guzmán Bustillos, was a farmer who also made a living on the side by growing marijuana. His mother, Maria Consuelo Lora Perez, was a devout woman with a strong character, who raised her children with the little she had. Joaquín was one of 11 siblings. Since he was a boy, they called him El Chapo because of his height, short and stocky. He didn't even reach 5'3", but he had a steady gaze, never blinking. As a child, he didn't have toys, he had machetes. He didn't go to parks, he went to the mountains. And he didn't learn English or algebra. He learned how to carry bundles of marijuana, how to dodge soldiers, and how to survive. As soon as he learned to walk, he also learned to work. He sold oranges by the roadside to help his family, but in that region, fruit didn't bring in as much as the plants that grew hidden among the bushes. By the time he was 10 or 11, he already knew what a marijuana plant was and how to harvest it without leaving a trace. One of the few schools in town saw him arrive, and also leave soon after. He only made it to 6th grade. Some say it was out of necessity, others claim he simply wasn't interested in studying. His thing was something else, the streets, the countryside, smuggling. There's a story the old folks in town tell. One day, when he was a teenager, his father kicked him out of the house, beating him, drunk and furious. Joaquín walked for miles on foot to reach his maternal grandfather's house. There, far from his father's violence, he discovered the silence of the mountains, but he also began to make his first connections with the harvesters. Even back then, he was already starting to stand out from the rest. Quiet, but alert, observant, and always determined. His surroundings shaped him. In Badiraguato, there was no future, only options: emigrate to the United States or get into the business. And Joaquín chose the path that offered power and respect, even if it was outside the law. There, in the midst of the harshest poverty, where the state was little more than an empty word and the narco was a god both feared and revered, the boy who would one day become the most famous drug trafficker in the world was shaped. In Sinaloa, when the future is measured in fields of poppies, destiny is written with gunpowder. And Joaquín Guzmán had already started writing his own. It was the 1970s. In rural Mexico, drug trafficking was no longer just a rumor. It was a structure, an alternative economy, a way to survive and to stand out. And in the remote mountain villages, where hunger was routine, the narco was almost a trade. Guzmán became a trusted young man. His job was simple, but crucial. He coordinated the transport of drugs by small plane. They say he did it with brutal efficiency. If someone was late, they didn't get paid. If something went wrong, he was the one who took the hit or made someone else pay for it. But the real turning point came when he met Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the boss of bosses, who led the Guadalajara Cartel, the first major conglomerate of Mexican drug trafficking. Félix Gallardo, with his business vision and political connections, understood that Guzmán wasn't just a pawn, he was a young wolf hungry for power. El Chapo started out as a logistics operator. Soon, he was in charge of moving increasingly larger shipments, especially of marijuana and cocaine. He was already credited with being responsible for securing the land routes from Sinaloa to the border, bribing police officers, threatening mayors, and corrupting anyone who got in the way of the business. By the age of 25, Joaquín Guzmán was the lord of the routes, the one who made sure the drugs left the mountains and reached the border without a hitch. It was during these years that he coined a phrase that, more than a threat, was a way of life. If you cooperated, you got rich. If you got in the way, you didn't live to see the morning. During this period, he also began to weave his own network of loyalties, recruiting men who would rise alongside him, Nacho Coronel, Mayo Zambada, the Beltran Leyva brothers. And he also started bringing in his own family, cousins, brothers, uncles, all of them, little by little, at the service of the new boss on the rise. They say that, on one occasion, he saved a multi-million-dollar operation by ordering a last-minute detour when he found out that soldiers had been alerted. The cocaine crossed the mountains along a path that only animals knew. He didn't just save the shipment, he earned respect. The short guy from the ranch was now someone the other bosses were starting to fear. He didn't have an education, but he understood logistics better than a general. He didn't know anything about politics, but he bought loyalties like a senator. And he was still young, just getting started. And so, between small planes, machetes, secret routes, and paid-off silences, El Chapo began to forge what would soon become his own empire. When giants fall, there are always others who rise. And El Chapo already had the plan, the men, and the ambition. The late 1980s were an earthquake in the world of Mexican drug trafficking. The fall of the Guadalajara cartel, after the murder of DEA agent Enrique "Kiki" Camarena, left a huge power vacuum. Miguel Ángel Felix Gallardo, the boss of bosses, was arrested in 1989, and with him, the old order collapsed. But where others saw ruins, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán saw opportunity. It was then that the empire was divided into franchises and a new player emerged, the Sinaloa Cartel. It wasn't an official name yet, but its presence was already being felt. El Chapo, together with the quiet but influential Ismael El Mayo Zambada and the Beltran Leyva brothers, began to take control of routes, contacts, and territories. From his stronghold in the mountains of Badiraguado, Guzmán wove a network that spread like a spider web. They trafficked cocaine from Colombia, smuggled drugs through tunnels at the U.S. border, bought ranches, small planes, weapons, and above all, loyalties. Corruption was no longer just a defense mechanism, it had become part of the system, and El Chapo became a master of that game. The legend of the narco tunnels began with him. One of the first was discovered in 1990 in Douglas, Arizona. It had ventilation, rails, and electric lighting. It wasn't just a cave, it was a feat of engineering. Guzmán understood that it wasn't enough just to grow drugs. You had to move them quickly, quietly, and smartly. Meanwhile, his image was transforming. From operator to boss, from boss to kingpin, from kingpin to legend. People said he helped the poor, that he funded local festivals, that he sent cement for people's homes in the village. He was a narco, sure, but he was also one of our own. But power comes at a price, and in 1993, the violence reached a whole new level. That year, at the Guadalajara airport, one of the darkest and most chaotic episodes in its history took place. Armed men ambushed a convoy. The target was Chapo Guzmán, but the shootout ended with the death of Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, the Archbishop of Guadalajara. The news shook Mexico. The government, the church, and the DEA all set their sights on Joaquín Guzmán. He was no longer just another drug trafficker, he had become public enemy number one. The myth had turned into a threat, and the manhunt was just beginning. That same year, Guzmán was captured in Guatemala and extradited to Mexico. He was imprisoned in the maximum security prison of Puente Grande, Jalisco. But what seemed like the end was just another chapter, because in Chapo's world, not even prison is a limit. They locked him up thinking it was the end. They didn't know that being locked up only sharpened the beast. When Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was captured in Guatemala in 1993, he was only 36 years old. They took him to the maximum security prison of Puente Grande in Jalisco, a fortress that was said to be impenetrable. But it wasn't an ordinary prisoner who walked those prison halls, it was an architect of power. From the very first day, El Chapo began to rebuild his empire from the inside. He bought loyalties, formed alliances, and sent messages to the outside. Within a few months, the prison was already his. The guards respected him, and some even served him. The inmates followed him, and his cell became his office. He controlled visits, parties, and privileges. Prostitutes came in, orders went out. They say he had keys to the cells and that his personal chef prepared whatever dishes he requested. He wasn't an inmate, he was the boss. Puente Grande was known as Puerta Grande because Chapo crossed it whenever he wanted, even before his escape. During those years, the Sinaloa Cartel became even more solidified. Guzmán's leadership didn't fade behind bars. On the contrary, it turned him into a legend. His image became inflated with legends and respect. His allies, like Ismael El Mayo de Zambada, kept the machine running while Joaquín pulled the strings from his cell. But the story that made him legendary happened on January 19, 2001. In the early hours of that morning, Chapo escaped from Puente Grande. The official version claims he hid inside a laundry cart with the help of prison staff. But former cartel members tell a different story, that he walked out, greeting the guards as if the door belonged to him. The escape was a national scandal. There was talk of complicity involving at least 70 officials, like something out of a movie. And when Mexico woke up, the most wanted drug lord was free again. The following days were nothing but smoke and mystery. People said he had taken refuge in the mountains of Sinaloa, that he had crossed the border, that he was in South America, but no one knew for sure. The only thing that was clear was this: El Chapo was back and stronger than ever. In the years that followed, Guzmán forged alliances with Colombian cartels, expanded routes into Central America and the United States, and solidified the Sinaloa Cartel as the most powerful in Mexico. He controlled ports, clandestine airstrips, and key border crossings. He had escaped from prison, but more importantly, he had escaped from being forgotten. And now, from the shadows, he would run a criminal empire like nothing anyone had ever seen before. El Chapo was no longer just a boss in the mountains. Now he was setting the rules for crime across an entire continent. After his escape from Puente Grande in 2001, Joaquín Guzmán Lora didn't go into hiding, he reinvented himself. He emerged from the shadows with an even greater thirst for power and a business-minded approach to crime. He didn't just want to be a kingpin, he wanted to be an empire, and to do that, he needed to eliminate his enemies. The country entered a new era of violence. Drug trafficking territories turned into battlefields. The Sinaloa Cartel, under his leadership and that of his allies, Mayo Zambada, Juan José Esparragoza Moreno, known as El Azul, and the Beltran Leyva brothers, faced off against other emerging groups that wanted a piece of the pie. One of the fiercest enemies emerged from within their own ranks, the Zetas cartel, a group formed by former soldiers who left the Gulf Cartel to create a brutal and ruthless organization. War had been declared. During this time, executions, decapitations, and messages on banners hung from bridges became part of the Mexican landscape. But while the country was bleeding, El Chapo was expanding his reach. From the mountains of Sinaloa to the streets of Ciudad Juarez, Guadalajara, and Tijuana, the Sinaloa Cartel was fighting simultaneous wars, but also strengthening its international trafficking routes. The drugs left from Colombia and Bolivia passed through Central America, crossed Mexico like open veins, and reached Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, and Madrid. With every move, El Chapo gained more power, but also more enemies. One of them was particularly symbolic: Arturo Beltran Leyva, a former partner and ally. In 2008, after the capture of Alfredo Beltran, known as El Machomo, which, according to the Beltran family, was orchestrated by El Chapo himself, one of the strongest alliances in Mexican drug trafficking was broken. The Beltran Leyva vowed revenge. The war between blood brothers and crime partners was brutal, personal, and without rules. Hitmen multiplied, the cartel fractured, but El Chapo held strong. He had built a horizontal, solid structure where he was the center of power, but not the only pillar. At the same time, his legend kept growing. While the Mexican government ramped up the war on drugs under President Felipe Calderón, El Chapo became even more elusive. The raids failed. Operations ended in smoke, and everywhere people talked about the ghost from the mountains who controlled everything. The curious thing is that in the midst of all this chaos, El Chapo kept acting as a benefactor to poor towns, funding local festivals, handing out money, and helping families in need. Many saw him as a kind of dark Robin Hood. They protected him, admired him, and sang about him. He was the most wanted criminal, but also the most untouchable. His face started to appear on T-shirts, in narco corridos, in the whispers on the streets, and in secret reports from Washington. In 2008, the United States put him on the list of the world's most dangerous criminals, but it didn't matter. El Chapo had already crossed borders. He was a living legend, a boss of bosses. When the empire grows too large, even the palace rats start looking for their own crown. 2009 marked the beginning of a brutal crackdown against Joaquín Guzmán Lora. He was no longer just public enemy number one in Mexico, but Lora was also in Washington. The DEA, the FBI, and the Treasury Department joined forces with Mexican authorities under Felipe Calderón's administration to catch the man who had turned Mexico into a war zone. But El Chapo didn't just hide, he vanished. He didn't use phones, and he never slept 2 nights in the same place. He moved through tunnels, caves, and towns where he was more respected than the president himself. During those years, the pressure didn't just come from the government, his empire began to crack from within. The split with the Beltran Leyva triggered a bloodbath among former allies. Betrayal was a poison that spread silently. Hitmen switched sides, informants started to talk, and the sons of old friends began to see him as a burden. Meanwhile, El Chapo's image was becoming more and more public. He wasn't just a figure from the underworld anymore. He was starting to become a legend in ballads, on the news, and even in diplomatic meetings. There were those who hated him and those who worshipped him, but no one could ignore him. In 2012, with Enrique Peña Nieto's arrival to the presidency, the pressure increased. The United States demanded his head. They wanted to show that the Mexican government hadn't surrendered to crime. And then, after more than a decade on the run, on February 22, 2014, in Mazatlan, they caught him. It wasn't in the mountains, it wasn't in a shootout, it was in a beachfront condo. They found him asleep in a high-end apartment without a single shot fired. It was almost humiliating for the legend. The myth of the man who couldn't be caught crumbled for a moment. Images of Chapo handcuffed, walking down a narrow staircase, went around the world, but many in Sinaloa didn't believe it. They said it couldn't be, that they wouldn't catch him that easily, that Chapo would only be caught if he wanted to be. And maybe they weren't so wrong, because just a year later, the world would witness something that seemed impossible. Sometimes, reality is stranger than fiction, and the whole world becomes an audience to a script written by a fugitive with more than enough power. On July 11, 2015, at 8:52 p.m., Joaquín Guzmán Lora, known as El Chapo, vanished from the Altiplano maximum security prison, a facility built specifically to prevent someone like him from escaping. The cameras caught him for the last time calmly walking into the shower in his cell. Minutes later, his silhouette was gone. No struggle, no alarm. Nothing. The escape was flawless. Beneath the shower, a tunnel over 1.5 kilometers long, perfectly ventilated, with lighting, rails, and even a motorcycle adapted to run on those rails, was waiting for Guzmán. It led him directly to an unfinished warehouse in the middle of the countryside. It was a work of surgical engineering. A masterstroke against the Mexican prison system. Social media exploded. International media couldn't believe it. And governments, publicly, expressed embarrassment, but privately they knew they were up against something much bigger than just a drug lord. But the story wouldn't end there. No, El Chapo's escape was just the first act. The second would come with an even more outrageous scene, a secret interview with actor Sean Penn. Yes, the same Oscar-winning actor. Through the Mexican actress Kate Del Castillo, who for years had expressed her sympathy for the drug lord on social media, a clandestine contact was established. Del Castillo, acting as an intermediary, arranged a meeting that was documented in a report published by Rolling Stone magazine. In a remote spot in the mountains, under the protection of heavily armed men, Sean Penn and the world's most wanted drug lord met face to face. They talked, toasted, and laughed. And El Chapo, as if it were a documentary, spoke about his childhood, his life in the drug trade, and how he felt he had no other choice but to follow that path. El Chapo was no longer just a fugitive, he was a trophy, and the whole world was about to witness his downfall, American style. In the early hours of January 19, 2017, while the world was focused on the imminent inauguration of Donald Trump, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was extradited to the United States. It was a surgical move, almost symbolic, a gift from the Mexican government to the new American president. The plane transporting him landed in New York, and the most heavily guarded city in the world prepared for the most high-profile drug trafficking trial since Al Capone. This was the beginning of the end for El Chapo, but also the start of the spectacle. During 3 months of trial at the Eastern District Court of Brooklyn, more than a dozen witnesses, including former partners, ex-allies, enemies, and even family members, took the stand to testify against him. One of them was Jesus Belray Zambada, brother of Ismael El Mayo Zambada. Another was Vicente Zambada Nibla, known as El Vicentillo, son of El Mayo. All of them were looking to reduce their sentences in exchange for exposing the inner workings of the Sinaloa Cartel. They spoke about multi-million-dollar bribes to Mexican politicians and massive shipments of cocaine hidden in cans, airplanes, submarines, and even freight trains. Witnesses recounted how Guzmán ordered the torture and execution of enemies, how he corrupted officials, and how he ruled from the shadows. Everything was laid bare before the eyes of the world. But it was also the trial where Mayo Zambada's name came up again and again as the real puppet master. And even though everyone was talking about El Chapo, the other boss remained free. The international press covered it minute by minute. It was a mix of narco soap opera, courtroom drama, and boundless morbid curiosity. Every statement was a bombshell, and with each passing day, the scale of the empire Guzmán had built became even clearer. Finally, on February 12, 2019, the jury found him guilty on 10 counts, including drug trafficking, money laundering, murder, and organized crime. The sentence was handed down on July 17 of that same year, life in prison plus 30 years. The judge looked at him and said, "You caused an immense amount of human suffering. There is no turning back." Guzmán was sent to the maximum security prison ADX Florence in Colorado, known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. A fortress of concrete, cameras, and windowless cells, where sunlight enters only a few hours a day and prisoners spend 23 hours alone. He remains there to this day. No tunnels, no helicopters, no ballots, no escape. But the myth, that still lives on. They locked up the man, but not the myth, and certainly not the business. When Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was locked up in ADX Florence, many believed that meant the end of the Sinaloa Cartel, but they were wrong, because the power of an empire doesn't always rest on a single name. And Guzmán knew it. Even before his final downfall, his sons were already positioning themselves. Iván Archibaldo, Jesus Alfredo Guzmán Salazar, and Ovidio Guzmán López, known as Los Chapitos, began taking control of the routes, the contacts, and the finances. With young blood, technology, and brutality, they ushered in a new era. But they weren't alone. By their side or behind the scenes, there was always Ismael El Mayo the Zambada, the old fox who was never captured. The same man who helped Guzmán escape from Puente Grande, the one who negotiated with the Jalisco cartel when Iván and Alfredo were kidnapped in Puerto Vallarta. The one who, according to former DEA agents, moved heaven and earth to rescue Ovidio Guzmán during the infamous Culiacanazo on October 17, 2019, when the entire city was engulfed in fire and bullets to prevent his capture. It was a display of power rarely seen. Shootouts all over the city, hostages, roadblocks, and vehicles set on fire. And a clear message: the cartel is in charge here, and the cartel doesn't forget. Although Ovidio was released that time, in January 2023 he would be recaptured in a more discreet operation. Today, he is in the United States awaiting trial, just like his father. But the other Chapitos are still in charge, and with them, the legacy continues. The Sinaloa Cartel not only survived El Chapo's downfall, but also diversified, expanding into new routes, trafficking not just cocaine, but also fentanyl, methamphetamine, and weapons, adapting to the new rules, the new landscape, the new war. The Chapitos imposed their own style, more visible, more ostentatious, more digitalized, social media, younger hitmen, fleeting loyalties. But the core remains the same: family, blood, and territory. Joaquín Guzmán Lora may be buried in concrete and silence, but his image still shows up in ballads, in the alleyways of Sinaloa, in the FBI's files, and above all, in the structure of an empire that didn't fall with his capture. Because in the end, like every legend, El Chapo never truly died. The price of the empire Joaquín Guzmán Lora had it all: power, respect, loyalty bought and feared, countless amounts of money. He was a ghost who crossed mountains, tunnels, and borders. A poor farmer who became a living legend. The man who outsmarted the state once, twice, 3 times. The one who humiliated governments, defied time, and pulled it off until he couldn't anymore. Today he lives in a 2-by-2-meter cell in the most unforgiving prison on the planet. No windows, no human contact, no ballots, no mountains, no family, no escape. His days are identical, his nights endless. The freedom he once tasted among helicopters, women, guns, and parties is now just a memory locked away with him. And that's where the question nobody wants to ask begins. Was it worth it? Because while his children keep playing the game, while his name still echoes in narco corridos, in case files, and in popular culture, Guzmán Lara is nothing more than a myth trapped in living flesh, a king without a throne, an empire without touch, a man who had everything and lost it all. El Chapo learned, maybe too late, that real power isn't in the fear you inspire or the money you pile up. It's in being able to hug your children without a glass between you, in walking down the street without looking over your shoulder, in sleeping without waiting for someone to break down your door. Because in the end, what seemed invincible turned out to be human, and what seemed eternal ended up locked away forever. That's it for our story today. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time for another amazing story.